All right, how you all doing? This one is a challenge because the subject, this man, is complicated, as most geniuses are complicated. He was called the angriest man in jazz, and may well have been, because he had a very fiery temper, to the point that although Duke Ellington was on the road for 6 decades, he only fired 3 people personally, himself, go up to the guy and go, "You fired." The first was the great trumpeter Bubba Marley, and the last was the subject of this discussion, Mr. Charles Mingus. You could have guessed, huh? Yeah. Mingus was born on a military base in Arizona. And soon after that, he moved to Watts. Very interesting story about his upbringing, his heritage. He once wrote a piece called Self-Portrait in 3 Colors because by some estimations, those 3 colors were black, white, and yellow. And by other estimations, they were black, white, and red. Whether you say he was a mixture of African, European, and Asian, or African, European, and Native American. Nonetheless, he was a mongrel, that's for sure, as he would say. And his father, as a matter of fact, may have been raised as white up until the age of 14. So Mingus was a fair-skinned young man, but unfortunately for him, not fair-skinned enough to avoid racism, which plagued him his entire life and was probably the source of the majority of his anger. Growing up in Watts with very humble beginnings, like most poor people, he had a poor education. Just basic education, reading, writing, arithmetic education. And that also bled over into his musical education. He started out as a trombone player and then eventually switched to cello. And as a young kid, in his very, very early experience in music, he was denied admittance into the local youth symphony, not because he couldn't play, but because he could not read music well enough. This scarred him. And maybe that is why in his life he recorded over 100 albums and composed over 300 scores. He was making up for that early rejection. And I think that was another source of the anger that followed him throughout his entire life. Now, later, he was asked to join a band, but not as a cellist. He had to play bass. And since he had played the cello, he had pretty good technique on it, it was a fairly easy transfer from the cello to the bass, and he was quite successful. Matter of fact, most people never realized he played anything but the bass. As he moved up through the ranks of bass players, touring with Louis Armstrong and people like that, he ends up in New York. And he decides that he is going to fix his education. So he spent 5 years studying privately with the first chair or the principal bass player in the New York Philharmonic, only the best. 5 years private lessons. And he quickly became known among jazz circles as a bass prodigy, an unbelievable technician. This fact is quite often overshadowed by his tremendous output as a band leader and as a composer. But you talk to any bass player about the top 3 or 4 bass players in the history of jazz, and Mingus' name will come up. He was like that. And he pursued it. Once again, that early rejection caused him to go beyond the call of duty to make sure that he was well educated and well trained, even though he already had a professional career as a bass player. So he played like everyone played with these standard bands, Art Tatum and, Armstrong. And I didn't mention Ellington. He played with Ellington for a short while until Ellington fired him because of his attitude, his temper. He played with all the guys in the bebop era as well. And somewhere along the line, I think he kind of figured out that his best move was not to be in someone else's band, but to have his own, because he was a very creative force. And as I said, he had that short fuse. So although he continued to gig with other musicians throughout his career, he always had his own thing. This took the form of a group called the Jazz Workshop. And about the same time that he was establishing the Jazz Workshop, which was simply a conglomeration of young aspiring musicians who wanted to record and perform their own original music, the avant-garde guys, he also wanted some independence. He wanted control over his music and his fortune. So he started debut records with Max Roach. So in the 50s, he had his own recording company. He had his own publishing company. And he had his own jazz workshop, which was a conglomeration of musicians that did experimental music, played each other's compositions, arrangements, etc. And it is from those various pursuits that his stock as a band leader and composer started to rise. This is all in the 50s. In the early 50s, perhaps one of the things that drove him was the concert he did with Dizzy at Massey Hall in Canada, in which it was a live recording. And when the recording came out, Mingus felt that the bass was under-mixed. He was too low in the mix. It was hard to hear him. He reacted by taking the masters and re-recording his bass parts on all of those tunes as loud as he wanted to. Many people say much too loud, but this was Mingus at his best. Somewhere around 1956, he built on something he had started as early as 16, writing expanded pieces. And a lot of these pieces were kind of experimental because not only did they use jazz and blues elements, they also used elements from classical music. He had also studied orchestration and music theory with classical composers and arrangers of the day. Now he had this piece, I hope I don't say it wrong, for the Anthropous Erectus. It is about man's journey from our biological beginnings to becoming an upright walking creature. And there's a section in there where there is what we might call free jazz. There's no structure, there's no harmonic structure, melodic structure. It is just random playing, as probably was the chaos of the human experiment early on in our development. Mingus had always been a practitioner of group improvisation. You listen to any of his later works, things like Haitian Fight Song, and you find that there are all of these lines against lines and then improvisation on top of improvisation. This goes back to the original approach to jazz, which was simultaneous improvisation, group improvisation. So although Mingus was a forward-thinking man, he also respected the legacy that he had inherited, and that may have been because he played with the pioneers of the day, including Louis Armstrong and some of Louis' musicians in the early days of his career. This is 56. 57 was a great, 57, 58, 59, great years for jazz. And so you may have had giant steps, and you may have had the great collaborations between Monk and Train, and so we had great albums coming out. But Monk was also there with Mingus Aoun. Mingus Aoun, and another great album that came out at the very same time as these other milestones. A lot of, because of his amazing output of literature, there are several repertory groups that have come out as a result. The Mingus Dynasty band, which I have heard a few times, and of course the Mingus Big Band. As a high school jazz director, I have played many of Mingus's tunes. Of course, my favorite would have been Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, because I love the tune, and I most certainly love and had great respect for the work of Lester Young, as did Mingus. He wrote that for Lester Young, and it was on one of his first critically acclaimed albums as well. It would be neglectful if I did not mention Danny Richmond, who was the drummer who stayed with him from the middle of his career right up into his death. The two of them made this great rhythm section happen that was the heartbeat for everything that Mingus did. And Jackie Bayard on piano completed that. They were the three musketeers, they were the three giants, they were the three musicians, they were the majestic trio. They were the heartbeat of what was Mingus. Did he have a temper? Yeah, he was known to fight. But he was also a very respectful man. One of the things that occurred in the 50s, around 55, he was playing a gig with Charlie Parker, and I think Bud Powell got sick. He was, alcoholic and had mental issues due to a severe beating at the hands of police. And he just one day could not communicate, could not play on the bandstand. He just walked off. There's no piano player. Now, Mingus was a great pianist. He could have probably been as successful a jazz pianist as he was a jazz bass player, but if he played piano, who was going to play bass? So he stayed on his bass, And then Bird started yelling for Bud to come back out loud over the microphone. And finally, Mingus got tired of it, and he walked to another microphone and he says, "This is not jazz. This is craziness. This does not represent us well." That was a big rub between he and Bird. That Bird was dependent upon heroin, and it was killing him. And a lot of the musicians who followed in his footsteps, it was killing them too. And so, although Mingus had great respect for Bird and worked with him, he also had this hatred for this persona that was so self-destructive and caused other musicians to also enter into self-destructive behaviors. The fact is that that particular gig was the last gig that Charlie Parker played. He died only a few years later. As a result, as Mingus was very reflective, he wrote, "If Bird were a gunslinger, there'd be a whole lot of dead copycats." That you figure that one out tomorrow. And that title you won't find, because the title that we find today is Gunslinging Bird. So when you deal with Gunslinging Bird, that's what you're dealing with. And he is simply pointing out the fact that it's one thing to copy Bird's lines and whatever, but if you start copying his lifestyle, you probably won't live very long. He was very outspoken like that. As I said, he was an angry man. He had suffered from racism his entire life. He did have interracial marriages and suffered with reactions to that. It affected his career, and those marriages did dissolve one after another. The last one did, however, survive, and that wife is still pursuing his legacy. But he was not tolerant of these racial things. And Haitian Fight Song is about the liberation of Haiti, the first black country in the Western Hemisphere. He also wrote Fables of Faubus to talk about the racism of Abe Faubus in Little Rock, Arkansas, as he tried to keep those schools segregated, and many, many others. He spoke out about social injustice, about bad habits, as in Bird's drug use, alcoholism, that kind of thing. But he was a creative force. In 1993, the Smithsonian and Library of Congress, they acquired a great amount of Mingus's works. And the statement was that this may be one of the most substantial gatherings of artistic material that they have ever been able to obtain. This is the legacy of Charles Mingus. Like Ellington, who fired him, he learned from Ellington though. As Ellington would write music for specific musicians, he wouldn't say first alto sax, second alto sax, he put their name on it. One of the secrets of Mingus's success is he wrote his music for specific musicians as well. He knew their strengths and their weaknesses, And so as he was composing for a specific ensemble, he tailored his writing to fit the strengths of the people he was working with. That's revolutionary. And only Ellington was able to do that, other than Charles Mingus himself. So like I say, there are 100 recordings out there that he made. And there are 300 musical scores. You have no excuse for being ignorant of the contributions of Charles Mingus. And if this little talk has awakened you to one of the greatest talents this country has ever created, despite his weaknesses and his issues, then I suggest you go pursue his music, because you can spend a lifetime pursuing his music and barely scratch the surface of who and what Charles Mingus was. And let's not forget, he was also one of the greatest bass players that the jazz world has ever created. I hope that you have enjoyed this talk. I hope that it has raised your interest in the music of Charles Mingus. And believe me, I have only scratched the surface. It is now your move. Thank you.